Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the In the Company of Stars podcast, where we interview guests on magic, the occult, and related areas of interest. Our guest today is traditional astrological consultant Hawk Grubb of Student of the Stars.
Catherine, thank you for being with me here today. I'm very excited about this because when we've talked about astrology things before, you have been a great resource, and the times you've looked at stuff on my chart with me, it's been really, really fun. And so I'm really hoping that people can learn some more about astrology and learn more about what you do today. And hopefully people will check out some of your work through Student of the Stars. To start off, we have some kind of introductory questions, just as sort of like an icebreaker to help the audience get to know you a little bit. So I'm going to start with those. The first one, what was a moment where you experienced something that kind of showed you there was really something out there to magic and spirituality? Like I figure most people, they encounter something sort of unexplainable or weird or outside of the norm, and that helps lead us to where we are. So was there a moment like that for you?
I've had several of those moments. I feel like, every time I come up with a new working model for reality, I then have an additional one of those moments that like shatters it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just been the habit of reality for me. The first one of those was I started off life as like a materialist reductionist, like hard scientism, like nothing that cannot be measured exists, like there is no God. It's that the usual ream of boring opinions about metaphysical reality. And I used to do a lot of LSD when I was a young adult, and that sort of just kicked the door wide open for me.
Mm-hmm.
And forced me to reconcile with something that was beyond the explainable in my framework for reality. I had a vision of God that I referred to fondly as Math God, where so it was like a non-humanistic, like just sort of like fractal field, you know what I mean? And so I like perceived the fractal oneness of reality, like the usual. And I was like, well, that was some shit. Like, I don't know how to reconcile that with my understanding. Yeah, so from there I got into like Buddhism, meditation, and then from there I found Thelema and ceremonial magic and devotional deity worship.
Okay. So now you said that the vision you had was pretty fractal, that it was like this math god type of thing, which is interesting to me that astrology ended up a big part of what you do, since there's so much math to that, and sort of a lot of the Neoplatonic foundations that go along with that.
Totally.
Do you feel that the nature of that experience, like, did that lead you into that right away, or did that shape kind of how you looked at metaphysical things?
Really good question. I think that the nature of the vision was the way that it is because that was the nature of my understanding of reality, sort of underlying my like verbal description of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like I got the math god because I had like the math brain, and so that's what I like. That was my vision of oneness. You know what I mean? It was like a fractal, all-encompassing like undulation of like this of like reality source code.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the same sort of like inclination is what definitely drove me to astrology, but it didn't happen all at once. I like went to school for neuroscience after that, which was like that's my undergrad degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like a pursuit of trying to understand like the systems level of like consciousness, like how does it work, like what. And so when I got into Hellenistic astrology, it very much had that same ordered, structured type of thinking in like inherent to it, more so than some strains of sort of like topically available modern astrology. So yeah, I don't know if that really answered your question.
It's interesting to me that you went into neuroscience. I didn't know that you had done that. when you were describing the fact that you've had so many experiences where you come up with kind of a new model of viewing things, and then you have an experience that shatters that model. The first thought that I had there was one of I did a large part of the required courses for a psychology degree, but ended up not adding that as a third major because it would be too much. But one of the really fascinating professors I had was a neurologist, and um, we were going through this class on motivation, and every lecture he would present a model that researchers had come up with for understanding human motivation. And then as soon as he was done presenting the model and explaining why it made so much sense, he would present something experimental that destroyed the model and showed us that it wasn't real. And he was one of the only professors I had who that was consistently his teaching method, was to
That's awesome.
set up this thing and then destroy it, so that you would know that, like, hey, we come up with these theories and these theories aren't really there. So that's really
that is
you
that is
get
the
into
most
that.
accurate way to communicate about theory of mind.
Mhm.
Like, because that's like exactly that's exactly what I got out of my degree as well. Was like, because I was like we can totally figure out how consciousness works. No, we have literally no idea. Yeah, all of our models are constantly being broken by experimental evidence, and it is a blast.
And I think it's interesting to look at that, because so much of these models, they're dealing with something that's not materialistic, but they're still trying to deal
Totally.
with it from a material frame. And,
Yeah, but it's really metaphysics almost.
mhm.
Yeah, so that's part of the reason why I turned to the occult, is I was like, I can't get a whole picture with the available tools of materialism, which is fine. That's like not necessarily science's job to do to something as big as consciousness.
Mhm.
I mean, I think it can be within science's purview, but we're just like not there with the measurement right now for consciousness. There's no way we're ever going to figure it out, like in my lifetime anyway. So I had to like look elsewhere. That's why
Yeah,
I picked up a religion minor at the same time, because I was just like so interested in combining those two ways of knowing, the like scientific and the metaphysical.
and I think that's obviously the whole can't get all the answers through science was the driving factor behind all of the scientists, magicians through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment.
Totally.
And I think we're starting to see kind of a reconciliation of that, where you're getting more science writers and science thinkers who are looking at indigenous forms of science, and recognizing
Yes.
that indigenous lifeways are a form of science, that they're not just superstition or traditional practices, that they fit the model of what science is. It's just a slightly different scientific model than what we're used to in the modern West.
Oh
And
yeah.
so with the idea of these things, that there's multiple different models and different things that knock the models down, astrology clearly is sort of like that. There's
Yeah.
you have
I didn't really
people.
solve anything for myself here.
Well, just even in choosing an approach, you've got Hellenistic astrology, traditional, medieval, Renaissance, modern. Um, so you mentioned that your approach is Hellenistic, but could you kind of maybe talk us through a little bit what some of the key differences are, and why the Hellenistic one is the one that you're drawn to?
Um, so to be totally real, I was drawn to Hellenistic because that was what was being offered by my teacher. That's really why I selected it. So I study with Achyuta Das, who is a really talented astrologer who learned from Robert Schmidt, and I think Chris Brennan played a role in his education as well. And so I found him by chance. He just like happened to have a yoga studio near my house.
Hmm.
And one day, which is like crazy to me now, because now that I'm into the community, I see that he is like one of the people I would have for sure chosen as my teacher, now that I'm like aware of the breadth of the available teaching
Mhm.
choices. So it's just wild to me that this person was just like in Maryland, like right, like, you know what I mean, like right close to me.
That is pretty
Uh,
amazing.
yeah, and so I went to a class with him, and he explained the thing that Hellenistic had, or his the take on Hellenistic that is brought to us by Robert Schmidt, like got me so into it, was the consistent aesthetic logic, and the just like the way that there was like a thread of consistency that like moves through the system. Like a planet is well dignified, like Mars is well dignified in Aries due to the essential dignity scheme, and then we have like other, or and like he's ill dignified in Cancer, and there are these like consistent like threads of meaning as you like move through the system, as opposed to it just feeling like sort of intuitively derived, commonly agreed upon vibes, if that makes sense. There's like a sort of there's like an operational logical language that's like at work in Hellenistic astrology, because it comes to us from a time when people who were exploring spiritual reality, it hadn't quite gotten so separate from astronomy, if that makes sense. So it feels to me very much like it's like very much in line with like the methods of science, the aim of religion, if that makes sense. So like I find that super appealing.
Okay. I figure like you probably also keep a logical framework because there's so many accretions of different ideas and methods and things as you get further and further out from that, as you're sort of taking a system and building it with adding things from different systems.
Yeah.
That's gonna just break down the logic over time.
Yeah, totally. So I kind of try and keep a framework, but it's very loosely held, if that makes sense. Because sort of the nature of the problem is that we can't see the whole thing. It's like why we need to use things like astrology to have like a metaphorical framework to describe the whole, because you can't actually like interact with it directly, like the all, except through like, I guess, like religious experiences. But that's not really practical when you're trying to give somebody like direct actionable advice.
Yeah.
You're like, BRB, let me like commune with God for like 3 hours. Like, I mean, actually, that is like a totally valid way of doing that. I don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah, but
well, I think the actionable advice thing is kind of an interesting thing to hit on there, because my exploration of more traditional forms of astrology versus more modern astrology seems like one of the focuses of traditional astrology is pinpointing exact manifestations at exact moments and very real world things, as opposed to kind of like a psychological analysis of your feelings.
Totally. That's totally a great thing to bring up. Like, I mean, there are some forms of modern astrology that get as like techie as traditional astrology. And when I say traditional astrology, I'm kind of like blanket referring to the amalgam of medieval, Renaissance, and Hellenistic, because there are people who specialize, but like a lot of practitioners that are in my peer group and me to an extent. I mean, I definitely am mostly on the Hellenistic train, but it's impossible not to like be like absorbing other pieces and like bringing in stuff like that. So that's who I'm referring to, and I just like loosely gesture at traditional astrology. But yeah, that is like, but so there are sort of like techie forms of modern astrology, like the Uranian school of astrology. It, like, I know not firsthand, but I've heard has like a lot of like technology like that allows you to make like these concrete predictions and isn't quite so personality based. But yeah, one of the best things about traditional astrology is that it's very much like not every planet in your chart is about you even. You know what I mean? It's like your Mars placement, like that's not even necessarily you. Like that could be like the person you meet in like 1999 who like, you know, who you ended up like marrying and buying a house with. Like that's just like them in your chart, not you at all. It's not like your anger or your like sex drive. It's just like, it's literally like other people that exist that like are interacting with you.
That's really interesting.
So it shows these elements of like fate and fortune, you know, that like aren't just about like your feelings and like your psychology. So exactly, because like a lot of topical modern astrology is just kind of like almost feels like a big psychedelic mirror where you're just like, it's all me. Like this whole thing is me. Yeah, which kind of reveals that like underlying spiritual belief of like new age thinking, where like everything that happens is just like a reflection of yourself, and like your vibes can like change things that like will manifest conditions for you in your life. So in that regard, like your psychology kind of does reflect external conditions under that framework. So that's kind of an interesting like way in which they're actually similar.
And I think it's also kind of a very modern culture versus traditional culture thing. Like modern culture is very tied up on the self and very
Yes.
narcissistic, whereas a lot of traditional culture is, how are you interacting with your family? How are you interacting with your community? How are you interacting with your ancestors? How are you interacting with the land? And all of it sort of feeds together into an ecosystem as
Yeah, and
opposed to just a self system.
absolutely. And that belief that like there's nothing out there that isn't you would be like, I feel like totally absurd to like a person in like Hellenistic times.
Mm-hmm.
That there's no like fate that just like sometimes strikes you through like no fault of your own. Like I think that it's really important that our like understanding of reality account for that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. So, in terms of what astrology does and like how it works, what does a consultation usually look like?
So it depends. There are lots of reasons that people go to astrologers, and the but for me, I tend to specialize in a couple of different things. One is natal astrology, which I just absolutely love to death. It's like my first astrological love. So that is the practice of looking at the chart at the moment of your birth and using that to discern information about your entire life. So that can be psychological information, but it can also be like, who will you marry? When will you marry them? Like what is your life purpose? What types of things are you actively inclined to be good at? What types of things might you struggle with? Like where are negative fate facets going to just smack you around? And like when are good times to worry about that? So yeah, I think natal astrology is so nice in that way because it's so versatile. You can literally touch any piece of your existence using the natal chart. So I love that about it. And through that we can talk about like astrological remediation and like ways that you can actually potentially try and like push a little bit on the strings, like on the tendons of fate, and make it a little bit more amenable to life, amenable to human preferences. Yeah. And then of course there are other types, like horary astrology is something that I'm learning right now. I'm sort of in my apprenticeship on horary astrology. I'm in the middle of a year-long class with Achita. And so horary is totally different than natal in that it's like, say you had a question, you're like, where you would ask a question, and then at the moment the question is received by the astrologer, or at the moment that you ask it, depending on your preference, you cast the chart for the location of the astrologer at that time. So like if you ask me right now, like what would be like a potential question, like where is my cat? I would be like, I don't know, let's ask the stars. You know what I mean? I cast a chart for right now, like 8 p.m. my time in my location, and I would like interpret the location of the planets to discern the location of your cat.
Huh. Okay,
And
so
whether it's okay. Like we could also see that, like if it's in good condition, like is it like been got? Did a coyote get it? Like is it coming back? When will it come back?
so is there a relationship between the querent's natal chart and the horary chart, or is it just the moment of the question that's
So
the chart there?
it's like it can be done with just the moment of the question. So this is from a time, this became popular at a time when a lot of people didn't have any access to their natal chart. Birth times like weren't really, like you only had a birth time if you were like some kind of like noble, you know what I mean? But like a lot of people didn't know their birthdays in the 1700s, etc. Like especially not like people who weren't of noble heritage or noble position. So horary was very much like an everyman's form of astrology, where all you had to have was a question. So I think the tradition developed like that.
Okay.
But if I'm casting a chart that's more like, am I meant to be with this man? I would consider taking the querent's natal position in if, like, say, the dude's like the significator of the dude was like on natal Venus for the querent, and I just like happen to know that for some reason. I would be like, I would consider that, you know what I mean? But I wouldn't be like, oh, let me see your natal chart. Like I need to line it up and see what's going on. So it's like it's totally non-critical, but if you happen to know, it can provide additional omen info.
Okay. So, as I understand things, you have my natal chart pulled up.
I do.
So, what are some things that we can use as sort of examples of stuff you might look at when you're
Ooh.
looking at a chart?
So you have one of my favorite things. They said narcissistically because I also have it. which is placements across the 3rd house, 9th house axis, right? This is like my favorite thing. Okay, so you have your sun in Aquarius, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your moon in Leo. So those two planets are just opposed to each other, right? And so they exist across the axis. So houses refer to topics of life, right? So
Yeah.
you already know you have an Aquarius sun. You probably already know you have a Leo moon. But what's like the 3rd and the 9th house? Like we don't like this is like sort of the next level of astrology that like people who are vaguely familiar with their chart, like this tends to be where people like drop off in terms of the casual level. So I can just explain this like dichotomy to you,
Okay.
if that sounds good.
Yeah, that's great.
So it's kind of interesting too, because the moon is in the sun sign in your case, like the moon is in Leo. And then your sun is in a place that the sun doesn't love to be, Aquarius, because it's cold Saturn sign, right? Saturn is the traditional planet that is as far as humanly possible away from the sun, right?
Yeah.
So we can kind of think about the sun in Aquarius as like a wanderer who has like wandered far away from his home. So in traditional astrology, there is a scheme called the planetary joys, right? So the 3rd house is considered the joy of the moon. It sits below the horizon, so it's sort of like subterranean. It rules our local community, so like the neighborhood, short journeys, like journeys we go on regularly, sort of like earth-based spiritual traditions, oracular divination. And then the 9th house is like Deos, right? The house of the gods. So we've just left the house of the goddess under the earth in the 3rd house to go up to the 9th, right? Which is in the top half of the chart, right next to the culminating place, like the very peak of the sky, right? And so this is like kind of like the glorious church, like the glorious like Catholic Church, for example. It rules these like big religious structures and like government and law, and actually like astrology as understood by older peoples, like the Greeks, for example, was classed to the 9th house because it was one of these systematized ways of understanding religious questions. So there's this like dichotomy across this axis, right, where you have the house of the goddess, you have these like oracular visions, then you have systematized ways of discerning omen information in the 9th house, right? And so my teacher describes it as like the country preacher versus the Catholic Church. And so as people with placements across this axis, we have like access to both of these things, and we might like engage in a blending of the significations of both. So like myself, I feel like I am like very oracular, but I'm also interested in applying this like systemic, like intellectual framework to the pursuit of like understanding those oracles. Like I'm not just like sort of like downloading visions and then like kind of being like, what was that? Like not that 3rd house placements only do that, but yeah.
So for me, having like one foot in kind of intuitive old school witchcraft and folk magic,
Yes.
and then being highly educated in ceremonial and formal
Exactly.
magic, or being a bishop in a Catholic church that focuses on witchcraft.
It's like the perfect blending of the significations. And because your sun is in the joy of the moon, and your moon is in the joy of the sun. So it's this like beautiful, like synergistic, sometimes kind of conflicting, but this like additionally under that tension, there is this interchange going on where it's like the sun and the moon like love each other in a way, where like the sun thinks so well of the moon is there in the sun sign. He's just like, wow, I glorify you. The moon thinks like less well of the sun. She has no opinion on the sun's placement. The sun is in Aquarius, and the sun doesn't think super well of himself because he's under there in Saturn's sign. So it's like, yeah, so that like deep-seated, like almost like embodied way of knowing still has room to glorify the higher Deus, like churchy way of knowing, but maybe the churchy way of knowing has a harder time acknowledging the felt beauty of the 3rd, but like still knows it, of course, because it's like actually your life purpose is like really seated there in the 3rd. So yeah, you're a perfect illustration of this. And That's tight. Like, and maybe that ninth house thing is like more like your family background, because the moon can represent the circumstances into which we were born. So like that, I also have the ninth house moon. So like, for example, my family is Roman Catholic. My parents work in education, and like higher education is like signified by the nine.
My mother was a chairperson of the education board at our church, and I grew up Catholic educated
Sorry about that, like
Catholic schools.
peal of cackling.
Yeah.
I just love it when it works, you know?
Yeah.
Like, you'd think I'd get bored of it, but I just don't. Yeah, so that dichotomy is just gonna pervade your life and mine too. So I'm happy to know you.
Yes, me too. And that's really interesting. That's I don't think I've noticed them being like across from each other that way, but had never really asked much or looked much into what the meaning of that was. Like, I figured there had to be a significance with the sun and the moon being so directly in line, but
yeah, it's just simply, it means you were born on the full moon. That's what a sun moon opposition is. And like, I mean, my favorite visual for this is, especially because it's like the deus and then like goddess one, is I imagine Baphomet, right, with like his like their fingers up and pointing up to the heavens, and their other set pointing down to the earth. So when I think about it as my own chart, I always kind of imagine like the Deus channel, like running down like a lightning bolt from the heavens and like grounding out into the earth. And then there's like me in the center.
So anything else stand out as an interesting thing to point out, or?
Well, your sun in Aquarius is disposed by Saturn in the 11th in Libra. So you have an exalted Saturn, which is good. That Hellenistic dignity scheme I was talking about. Saturn likes to be in Libra because Libra is the time in the Northern Hemisphere when darkness finally begins to overcome the light. It's that equinoctial point, and Saturn's vibe finally starts to win out. So he's happy to be there. So the 11th house rules communities and groups. And so that third house sun of yours, that like traditional witchcrafty, like life purpose space, is sort of inherently connected to groups that are also interested in that. So you are gonna like, I would expect like a wealth of community happening there. And it also makes contact to your moon too. So I think that additionally, but like religious community is going to be, that's like the strongest aspect in your chart, is that sun moon circuit is also connected to the 11, which is like a place of like allies and organized groups.
So in college, I was the president of our pagan student union, and then was deputy master of an OTO body for like 13 years. And am now part of organizing like 3 or 4 new religious and magical bodies.
There you go.
Yeah.
I mean, you're gonna have an easier time, like a more supportive relationship from the 9th house moon. But when the 3rd house sun comes in, like the more like embodied, like witchcrafty path, like there's a little bit more conflict from the groups and the allies.
Okay.
So yeah, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, obviously. Oh no, that's a lie. It's a trine. I'm sorry. I'm looking at a chart in a different software. No, you're all good. You're just supportive all around, pretty much.
Oh. Okay.
You have like a little bit of a square coming from Venus onto your Saturn, so that might be some other type of conflict. But from 3rd to 9th to 11th, it's all good. Just trines and sextile.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, thank you for that. That was pretty interesting. So, in your personal practice, do you incorporate aspects of astrological magic? And you mentioned remediations as an option when looking at natal charts. Do you recommend magical remediations or astrological methods for remediation to clients?
Hell yeah. This is like my favorite thing that I'm moving into now. I think I spent the first like 4 years of my formal studies like really trying to just get delineations down, and now I'm starting to think about like, how can this be helpful, like how can this serve people, like how can this make your life better, as opposed to just being this like academic thing that I'm like intellectually interested in, and like getting to have those like whoa so cool moments, which are still like totally valuable. But I'm really loving bringing more of like the astrological magic remediation portion into it, and I'm sort of starting to try and specialize as like a natal astrologer. I would love to just only read for magicians. Like that would make nothing would make me more happy than to just like only consult for like magically operant people.
So the types of remediations you look at, are they like electional remediations like with talisman work, or do you look at like other magical options for that?
Usually devotional practice is my number one go-to. So like remediation is a lot of the body of work on remediation is Vedic, in which I'm like not super educated on, to be honest. So I'm kind of trying, I have like a polytheistic devotional practice in my own life. And so I tend to recommend, I also feel like it's a very safe option to do devotional practice. It can be, talismans are sparky. You know what I mean? Like everyone's heard talismanic horror stories about like the moon talisman you made that was like where the moon was afflicted actually, and you didn't notice, and like suddenly you're like temporarily have like conjunctivitis or something because the moon rolls the eyes, or like that's like a light example. But yeah, like so for example, I'll just give you a quick example. In your chart, you have a sun that is in a place that the sun doesn't like to be. So like I would suggest a solar remediation practice for you. So the safest thing in the Vedic tradition would be planetary charity. So you could like give money, for example, so like planetary charity is just when you take a planet that is in a bad condition in your chart and you donate money of a number that is appropriate to the planet, like favored by the planet, to a group of people that is favored by the planet. So you know, you could donate a solar quantity of money every month to a hawk rescue, a solar animal. Like that's a Vedic practice, not the hawk rescue specifically, but and that's considered a universally like very safe way of dealing with remediation. So it's a good way to interface with your malefics, Mars and Saturn, who might be a little bit more punchy should you interact with them magically. But additionally, you know, like Libra Resh as a magical practice would be like the perfect option for somebody with an exiled sun or other such solar practices.
Interesting. That was not something that I realized was part of remediation work, but it's I think that makes it more accessible to people than just like, hey, buy this expensive electional talisman or make this difficult and dangerous electional talisman.
Yeah, I mean, partially it's just like as a practitioner, I don't know the rules of traditional image magic well enough to be functionally operant in it. And there was a huge learning curve there, and I'm just not there like practically. But I am extremely operant in like some forms of ceremonial magic and deity worship, and so this is what I know. And so just now I came to magic first and astrology second, and so just now I'm starting to like sort of like attempt to fuse these two things to create like to be able to communicate like my natural, like what I've just been doing over the last, you know, like 6-7 years for myself to my clients. So it's been a fun journey.
So in terms of things that you are doing for yourself, you are hitting your first Saturn return. It's a big, scary sort of thing. So I remember mine, and it was horrible.
Oh yeah, do you have any fun stories? Well, sorry, I'll let you ask the questions.
Yeah. Well, that was a bunch of people died, and my life completely changed. So,
Heck.
Yeah.
Nobody likes that. Sorry to hear that.
No, I figure with the whole Aquarian thing that it made sense that the Saturn return had a big impact. But are you doing any sort of well, I guess actually before even asking about remediations, I figure most people involved in magic are familiar with the concept of a Saturn return, although I wasn't until after going through mine. So it probably would have been useful to know. But
yeah, I mean, some people you'll find that even very magically operant people like have just not really gotten super into astrology, partially because of it has like an image problem due to like newspaper sun sign astrology. So like some people are just like,
So I guess before talking about magic and remediation for it, could you give kind of like a quick explanation of Saturn returns for people who may not be as familiar?
Yeah. So at the time of your birth, Saturn was in a specific point on the zodiac. And so the Saturn return refers to the 3-year period in which Saturn will be transiting the point at which he was during your birth. So basically it takes him 27 and a bit years to get all the way around the zodiac. That's how slowly he moves because he's so distant from the sun. So it takes all that time for him to come back, literally to return to the point he was at when you were born. And that conjunction is usually marked by some form of Saturnian reckoning. For some people, it goes better than others, but you can usually see that in the chart.
Okay. So what kind of things have you been doing to prepare for yours, and what sorts of things would you recommend that people do?
So I have a Saturn mantra that I came by way of Kelly Surtees, who is a wonderful astrologer out of Australia. Although I believe she has since moved, but yeah, so she is super cool. I can even provide that, so you can put it in the show notes to this if people are interested in it. Kelly posts days that are astrologically favorable to begin the mantra practice, usually a Saturday, like Saturn's day. So devotional practice to Saturn through mantra is like that. That's a Jyotish practice for remediation. Again, it's like mantra work is like pretty safe. People tend to be really cautious when doing malefic remediation. But yeah, so I started doing that about halfway through. I stopped my solar practice, which was sort of accidental, but partially I like sort of consented to it as an act of deference because the sun and Saturn are like diametrically opposed in the traditional scheme. And so I figured instead of like continuing to solar barrel my way through the Saturn return, I would just kind of like defer to his like presence and just let him show me whatever it was, as opposed to like working cross purposes to that, which is like sort of atypical approach. I feel a lot of people are interested in kind of like making it less what it is, because they've heard it's terrifying and awful. But I am sort of the position that like gods deserve deference, even if they're terrifying.
So
Saturn in my experience is only terrifying because of like he is what he is, you know what I mean? And like the thing that he represents exists in the world, like death, for example. That's a real thing. Like he's not bringing it upon me. You know what I mean? My understanding of astrology is very omen based, so it's like Saturn isn't going to do that to me, but it might like happen in my life. Like I will certainly die. Saturn's not going to like strike me with a scythe, but he is like the sign that signifies the existence of the thing. And so I think that magically we can like defer to, like we can like be in devotion to even those like terrifying facets of reality, and that helps us not to just like hide our eyes away from like half of God, if that makes sense.
So you're kind of taking the lean in and roll with it in order to gain something from the experience, as opposed to like run and hide from the experience approach.
Yeah, I'm trying to be as devotional as possible. Yeah, totally. Which is
I think that makes sense. That's something in my own magical practice where my teacher used to talk about the concept of a reality barometer, that like you should make sure that you have, if you're doing a lot of magical work, keep a couple things that you don't touch with magic, so that you can sort of judge how you're dealing with reality based on those things that you're not impacting. And to me, that kind of also spread out to the idea of sometimes you want to have experiences. Like there's things where it may be important to go through an experience and see how you handle that experience or what you learn from it, instead of necessarily just changing it with magic to avoid it.
Yeah, and I think about that all the time, that like question of like, how, first of all, how much of our fate is it even possible to shift? And if so, like, to whose benefit is that? Because, like, because, like, if you believe that, like, if you take the, like, sort of like oath of Lucifer perspective on the whole thing, it's like that every dealing with your soul is like, that is like a direct dealing with your soul from everything that happens to you is a direct dealing of, like, with your soul of God. Then like what are you doing? Like, why are you fucking with it? Like, and obviously there are many pragmatic reasons to do that. Like, obviously I'm a part of my existence, and I have to sometimes actually do things, and sometimes those things can be like magical things, and that's totally fine. That's not actually like worse for some reason than deciding to like get a job. Like, that's me doing things too. Like, and so is me doing magic. But it's it brings up this snarl of questions about like what's right to do in the world, in our lives. So yeah, just working through those slowly.
And I mean, it also kind of like bringing that up while talking about Saturn, it seems like that sort of kind of judicious, tempered nature of like deciding what you should leave and what you should change feels like that
totally
falls under a Saturnian thing. And
absolutely. Yeah, you're like, which of these things stays and which one do I like cut away with the scythe? Like, totally a Saturnian question.
yes.
That's
So
really cool though. I love the idea of the magical barometer where you just like leave something put.
yeah, no, it was always very useful. I mean, especially as I started magic sort of grew up doing little bits of magic and talking with spirits and learning magic, but started formally studying it when I was like 11. So at that
Wow,
kind
so
of
yeah,
age,
that must be even more fierce for you to like having that.
yeah, it was very important going through my young adulthood.
Totally, because it's just intertwined with like basically everything at that point. Like, once you really start, because at least I have this period of reference from before I did anything at all, where
Yeah,
I'm just like, that is what baseline me not actively pulling strings reality feels like.
I think
Although,
ultimately it's
no,
kind of
go ahead,
led to a
please.
more tempered approach where like there's a lot of things that I just don't do magic for when I could, because it's like, well, I should go through this, I should experience this. It's
Totally, and I mean, yeah, I mean, there's that idea that there's like your true will, and then there's like things that are sort of just like not that, but you're free to do them.
Mhm.
But is it actually helping you like roll your fate towards its towards the promise of it? Maybe not. Like, do I really need a Lamborghini? Do I need, like, what would be required of me to get one? Like, presumably devoting my life to like a shitty job that I don't want.
Yeah.
So it's like, not like I couldn't get that, but like, why would I do that? Like, for who? For why? Yeah.
Yeah. So on the subject of magic, from previous conversations, I'm aware that you are also drawn to Ebony Anpu's Tesseract magic, which, for those who aren't familiar, um, the line of teachers that I come from actually crosses through Ebony Anpu. But Ebony created a system called the Hawk and Jackal, which was a form of Thelemic witchcraft that dealt with Egyptian traditions and also with the magic of time and space, and sort of dealing with certain elements of quantum mechanics and quantum superposition, and collapsing the sort of selection of reality together.
Mm-hmm.
And which is, it's a very interesting, very weird magical space to be in, but it definitely deals with concepts of time and space, much like astrology does. Is there an overlap in those two interests for you, or do they sort of relate or impact each other?
I mean, I think again, it's that third house, ninth house thing where that sort of like undercurrent of felt sense embodied in the world witchcraft, that shows up in Ebony's work, and also the like ivory tower high level conceptual framework stuff, like things that bring those together. Like, the Hawk and Jackal system seems like really interested in the material world, right? And like the fundament of like physical reality. you know what I mean? Like more so than some of the, say, like more Golden Dawny overlays, which just feel like sort of conceptual overlays. Whereas like the Ebony Ampu system seems like it's like coming from the earth also, which is like really interesting with the time magic. It's like you're sort of like bending the earth to like allow yourself to move into superpositional spaces. So I think that really attracted me to it. And also this was the first like place that I ever, because getting into Thelema, I was like a little bit off-put by the hyper masculine deus solar divinity thing, because I obviously have this like rooting in the third house in my own chart, and it's in my life, in my magical practice, and I'm also like a woman, so I was just like, where is the moon? You know what I mean? Like, and like Crowley almost has this like disdain for the moon in some of his work, it feels like. And so when I bumped into Ebony Ampu, it was like so revelatory and celebratory, but not pedestally. Just like acknowledging like women as like these like fully sovereign beings, not just in his magical writing, but like also in the way that he like literally interacts with humans, it seems like, which is more than can be said largely for Crowley. I mean, he's great about it in his theurgic practice, but not so great on the ground. I've observed.
And I mean, I think for Ebony, he very much writes about it as like the importance of balancing the sun and the moon, and that you've got sort of the golden or the solar rights through the OTO, and then the Hawk and the Jackal provides the silver or the lunar rights, and that you can't,
like the night.
You can't have it without both. And
absolutely,
for him, his mother was a witch, as far as I understand, and I believe he comes from a witch blood family.
That's also my understanding.
So it just sort of makes sense that you've got that there, but it's really interesting to see that dichotomy, because like he was there at sort of the beginning of the computer age of things, and I think he had a pentacle on like an old floppy disk at one point, which was, I think, kind of like not a super unusual thing, because a lot of the people involved in 80s Thelema were also involved in early computer stuff. And
makes a lot of sense to me.
he's doing this bringing the witchcraft current back into Thelema, which obviously several people had tried to do. Gardner tried to do it, Parsons tried to do it, but Ebony did it in a way where it was more naturalistic, I think, and more like you said, like it wasn't putting the feminine on a pedestal like Gardner and like Parsons did. It was just like, it's there, it's important, it's part of things, just like everything else is. And so he's doing this kind of like more earth-based, more visceral thing, and from my limited experience of that part of Ebony's work, it is very visceral and very powerful. But then he's adding this super intellectual component with the quantum mechanics and the tesseracts and everything.
Right, which is like also something that I need in my like magical experience. Like I love that like earth-based lunar rites stuff, but like my brain is so much, it needs to be engaged also in the magic. Almost to like better allow it to give way to the like visceral, you know what I mean? But like it's like it has to be equally engaged for me. So I got so excited when I found Ebony's work for that reason, and that was a really big like game changer for me, because I was just like, oh, you can do both these things. Because I was lucky to run into him like kind of early on in my like practice, so I was just like, phew.
It kind of makes me wonder if he has a similar sun-moon alignment in his chart, because like the stuff
I've actually looked at his chart, and I just can't remember off the top of my head. But I'll get back to you on that later.
Okay. Be interesting to know. So, do you have any experiences that would be fun to talk about with his system, and kind of like with exploring the way time flows and interacts with magic through his system? Has that changed or impacted your understanding of time in astrological matters?
I've done very little work specifically with his time magic. It seems kind of scary to me, honestly.
I have the same feeling.
And a lot of his writing on the subject is like, do not fuck with this. If you're like, just don't. If you feel like you don't want to, just don't. which I took very seriously. I was just like, because he has like warnings all over that thing. So I'm just like, and I'm not the kind of magical practitioner where I see something like that and I'm like, oh yeah, I gotta get that. I'm just like seems reasonable. I will wait.
Well, I think I told you about like when I first started reading his work, where it's like I had the books up on my computer and was like reading them, and then went away for a couple hours and came back, and like not only were they no longer open on the computer, but the files were gone entirely.
Yes, totally.
And then I came back a couple hours later and the files were back and were open on the computer again.
Yeah, I think we discussed, I had a similar experience. So and it just, yeah, it's weird, man. It's like, it's fucky.
Yeah, just being around it starts shifting the fabric of things.
Totally, and it feels in a way like you went so hard on it that it's like as soon as you approach it temporally, like even just like beginning to, and this happens to me a lot with beyond just the system, but magically, like for example, I like as soon as I place an order for like say like a Sphere and Sundry product, who was like Caitlin of Sphere and Sundry is a really talented magician who does astrological wares, and so like I'll place an order, or I'll start to think about placing an order, and I'll get these effects that seemingly flow backwards down the timeline to like hit me. And I've noticed that too with like deciding to take LSD. Like I'll be at a festival or like not at a festival, but like at somebody's party, and I'll get the flavor on my tongue. Maybe this is like psychotic of me, but like, I'll get the flavor on my tongue and I'll just be like, tastes like acid. You know what I mean? Like I'll get that like acid teeth feeling where I just kind of feel the spaces in my teeth for a second. I'm like, that's weird. Moving on. And then 3 hours later, someone will be like, hey, I know this is random, but do you want some acid? And I'll be like, oh. So I feel like things with enough oomph, like with enough visceral, like raw power, just flow in all directions on the timeline.
Yeah, well, that makes sense for how Ebony built the system, and this is something that like we're starting to see in the traditional magic community also, with the idea that by praying to the saints or taking pilgrimages or working with a grimoire in the way that it was worked before, that you're tapping into the whole current of power and current of magical acts that other people have done with that, and that it's part of a continuum. And Ebony built that into like the consecration of the tools in the Hawk and Jackal system, and building sort of the cone of power in the Hawk and Jackal system is that your every instance of you doing magic over time and other people working that system is drawn in and invoked, so that it's like when you're working a magical act, it's like each instance of you working magic ever is working that magical act with you.
And sorry, go on.
So it seems like, yeah, he definitely has like this heavy head of current that's built up by doing that. So like anyone touching the system is sort of like plugging into or at least touching
like,
that. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I felt his presence in the system like really strongly, and which is like weird. That was probably one of the first times that I like really had that experience, because Crowley almost, I feel like, is so diffused across all the people touching his stuff that it's less like imminent, you know what I mean? Whereas like when I tapped that, it was just zzz.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. That concept I actually cover. I keep my he was the first person who elaborated on the concept of keeping your magical tools covered, because he was literally just like, don't break them out ever unless you're actively doing magic, because you want the only time for them to be active are moments that you want to be on the timeline of their use. So like no idle moments with the tools exposed to like reality. You want them totally like sealed basically until they're being magical tools like actively. So that way every individual point on the timeline for that object is magical.
That makes really a lot of sense. Very much like the whole sort of don't draw your sword unless it's being used kind of thing.
Totally. And I never bothered to cover my weapons until I read that explanation of it, because it's common like practice and people say to do it in the ceremonial tradition like all across it, but I had never heard that rationale before. And that was like when he brought like the timeline into it, I was just like, ooh, yes, it makes sense now. So yeah, he totally has that like scientific overlay that like explains like the properties of physical reality, which I just love so much.
So, so you said you haven't really done a whole lot with the Tesseract yet.
I had a weird one where I like kind of I gave it like a little bit of a shot. Like I gave it the old college try, or like started to sort of like sort of orbit around that system, and something really dumb happened. Like there was like my sister like forgot a consequential memory that we share temporarily. It was like something that she should have never forgotten, and right after I did that ritual, it was like that was the only effect. You know what I mean? It was just a dry run. I wasn't taking it super seriously. I just was kind of like, I want to like experiment with this. And the only thing that shifted for me was I kind of regretted frightening her about a television show when we were children. It was actually like Courage the Cowardly Dog. There's that bit where he goes like, "Return the slab," and I used to like torment her with this like for like weeks at a time, and she completely forgot it. Like the memory was just like gone from her mind for months, like that, and that was the only thing that changed because I didn't have an intention. You know what I mean? I wasn't like, okay, we're gonna like shift this way. Because like partially my devotional practice just like doesn't really allow for that, and partially it's a lot to ask of someone to be like, change reality around your will. I'm like, I'm not totally sure enough what my will is to do that. I mean, I can do it in pieces, but the Tesseract feels like it's just so holistic and so like major that like I'm just like, ooh, scary. But so I just kind of like went for it, just like sort of exploratorily, and the only thing that changed was that like regret that I had just seemingly never happened.
And that I've heard stories like that where the just little side things in people's life that don't seem like they would be major consequential things just shift. Like I knew someone who after turning the Tesseract, the knobs for the burners on their stove were not positioned the same way that they had always understood them being positioned before. Like he was like, it's a thing I do use every day. He's like, there's no way that I just forgot that. Like,
yeah, you're like, I'm not wrong about this. That was my
like,
experience too. I was just like, there's no way that you don't know this anymore.
Yeah. And which, I mean, again, it makes it really kind of scary. And the idea of sort of like
terrifying, because it's like, who are you now? You know, if like the people around you have different memories than the ones you lived through with them.
Right.
Like who am I now? You know what I mean? Like what happened to other timeline my sister? Where did she go?
Yeah,
I mean, obviously this is a very dramatic way of talking about this, but those were the like existential crisis thoughts that like entered my mind after this. I was just like, holy.
And that's why I kind of have held off on it, because it's sort of like it invites these questions that the rest of magic doesn't invite in. Of
right, because
like,
the rest of magic
reality?
seems
like,
so
who are you?
about like just moving around pieces and not like folding the whole. You know what I mean? Which is just like fucking bonkers. Yeah. So I mean, I still think about that all the time. Where in weird surreal moments, I'll just be like, what if I like shifted timelines and like, you know, my boyfriend wasn't my boyfriend anymore. Like I would like, how would we know? Like what?
And I don't know, maybe that's what we need to do in order to fix the world now, is just get a whole bunch of people turning the Tesseract so that we go back to the right timeline, as opposed to the post Super Collider Weasel incident from 2016.
Yeah, my knowledge of shitty things in reality has increased since I first interacted with the system. So like, but again, it's like one of the, you know, that wolves in Yellowstone proverb about environmental conservation?
I'm not sure.
So they culled all of the wolves in Yellowstone because of cattle farmers, largely, like back in the middle of the 1900s. And they were like, well, they're like, we have a problem. Let's fix it. There's a 1-to-1 solution. We will get rid of the wolves. They're eating the cows, right? So the deer population explodes, obviously, because we no longer have any predators. And they just destroy like all of the ground level foliage, like in the entire region. So like all the trees have like the bark like nibbled off of it, and like, you know, it was just a nightmare for the ecosystem, just because the perspective of individual people wasn't broad enough to understand the impacts. So I'm like, I am concerned about that issue. You know what I mean? Making like large scale magical changes.
Yeah. Well, that's I mean, I guess a good illustration of looking at intense experiences overall. Like one that I bring up is that we don't have a cosmic perspective. Like we don't know
Exactly.
what everything is from the eye of God. So like
Totally.
something may seem miserable for us, but it may be facilitating something larger. And so
Right.
yeah, like having your
And
kid
there's that
sucks,
deference to
but the world
Saturn, like
survives.
that deference to suffering, where you're just like, and you know, it's so hard to say things like this without sounding like a Protestant. You know what I mean? Where
Yeah.
it's like God wants you to suffer so you can be less shitty. It's a little bit tough to disentangle my like real feelings of like loving devotion to like God as it is
Mhm.
with some of the fucking bullshit that's just overlaid in my psyche due to my upbringing.
Yes. No, I definitely, as whenever I'm explaining that it's like, yeah, there may just be ends that we don't see. It's like, oh, I don't want to say like we're choosing suffering or say that like our suffering
Exactly.
is meaningless. It's like, no, it's meaningful that we're suffering and it sucks. Like our perspective is valid and matters too. But hey, maybe there's some reason that it's there that we don't understand. And maybe that reason is just figuring out how to get out of the suffering and like whatever we gain from that. But like, when we look at things and we're like, oh well, there must not be any bigger design or any architect because like why would this shitty thing happen? It's like, well, we don't
Yeah,
know.
like why would they let me like suffer like this?
Yeah, it's like maybe there's a reason, maybe there's not, we can't necessarily say.
Yeah,
Best
I
we
mean
can
the
do is
eye
just
is
go through
just
it.
so expansive, but it's so difficult to reconcile the fact that the eye is so expansive that that's like almost not its concern with the imminent felt presence of divinity
Yeah.
that we can experience moment to moment.
And I think that's just the thing where it's like we try to understand it from a human perspective, that it's like we're not both immensely transcendent and immensely immanent at the same time. We're just immensely
Right.
immanent, and
Right.
but things that aren't us could be both. Like,
Totally. And that's partly why I appreciate astrology, because it kind of lets us look at that like God's eye view a little bit.
mhm.
But you know, obviously my lens is smaller than that. So like the info that can get in through me as the viewer is like still going to be limited inherently. It's tricky. I think it's just one of those like ways that we have to ride as like incarnate beings who are like also like fucking magnificent spirits.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I guess my last question, um, less of one about how you've approached things, but one for more kind of how you might approach things in the future. I know personally, sometimes when reading Ebony's stuff, I'm like, there's a lot of amazing things here, and he has a lot of great pieces, and he explains those great pieces, but he doesn't explain it necessarily as like a system that you can just run with. Like it would never be like a Llewellyn book that like people
Totally.
can go
Like
pick up and just do. And I've talked with Jason Miller a little bit about it, and I know he has some stuff where he talks about briefly sort of the Tesseract, but he's also
I
had
did
some
not know that.
comments posted. So not going into any of his like stuff that he's written about it, just from our conversation and his public comments, he's kind of noted that the way Ebony presents it is very very Thelemic. Like it's very tied up in like a Thelemic understanding of the Kabbalah and a Thelemic understanding of Egyptian things. Although I think
Totally.
Ebony's understanding of Egyptian stuff is deeper than just the Thelemic version. Um, but
It definitely
that
explores like more territory in the Egyptian like cosmology.
Mhm. And but that sort of Jason's perspective is that that's probably part of why it doesn't necessarily feel like it comes together as a system because it's so tied up in trying to be Thelemic and tied up in trying to be Kabbalistic, but that like it would be interesting to see someone break it out of that and sort of like take the concept and take the root technology and build it into something that's more designed for that technology. And it seems to me like a Greek approach would probably fit that
Hmm.
pretty naturally because it very much fits with a lot of Greek mystery traditions and sort of the mathematics, and kind of coming at things from an astrological perspective. So, if you were diving deeper into the Tesseract, do you think you would try to work it as is with the sort of Egyptian Kabbalah, or do you think you would try to Grecify it, or like bring your astrological perspectives and geometrical perspectives into it to try to make it into a more holistic thing?
I think that the first step would have to be like in training myself to his original vision, which is like usually the best move when you're trying to learn something complicated and terrifying.
Yes.
Is to not initially make your first move like to fuck with it. Which is like definitely my inclination sometimes. But and that's not to say that it's impossible, but like I feel like it's so Egyptian and it's so Thelemic because he was so Thelemic, you know what I mean? Like despite like potential like drama or whatever, he was like very like he was like super devoted to Thelema and like that was like his magical base outside of like just I guess he grew up in sort of like almost traditional witchcraft, but he like like that is who he was. So it's kind of like, why did I see math god? It's because that was like the brain I had. Like why is his at that time like why was Ebony's magical system like so deeply Thelemic? Because it's like that is like who he was. So it's like feels difficult to like jailbreak it out of his context. You know what I mean? Like you like, but yeah, I don't know. So I have to get a lot better at it, I think, to even answer that question.
Okay.
I don't think I'm like intimately familiar enough with it to really like start to graft it onto my own cosmology.
I think that's a really fair answer, and I think it's kind of like how Jake Stratton-Kent often points out that some of the most important magical words are "I just don't know," and yet they're the magical words that most magicians don't seem to be able to use.
It's tough, especially when you're in like solar magic. Like it's really tough to be like, I don't know that.
Yeah.
Because that's like a Saturn lesson, you know what I mean? To be like, nope. And again, those two things are a little bit opposed.
Yeah, no, I think I did an AMA recently, and there was a question. I was like, I just don't work that system. I'm sorry.
Behold my ignorance.
But
yeah, I love that. I feel like it's a great practice to just be like, I have no idea.
Well, I mean, hopefully, I mean, I do think I think it would be interesting to see how people could approach that outside of the Thelemic context and if that's possible. So maybe this discussion will inspire some people to, like you said, explore it as it is and then sort of jailbreak it into what else it could be.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in that.
All right. Well, this was so much fun. And
yeah, totally. I love talking to you about this.
Thank you. I love talking with you. And I definitely learned some stuff, both about astrology and about myself. So that was cool.
Same.
And so, where can people find out more about what you do? Like, I know you've started doing more consultation work, and I definitely recommend that anyone looking for an astrological consultation check out you as an option. I've pointed some friends in your direction before when they've been considering that, because I think there's a lot of points when you're describing things where you're like, I'm learning this, I'm starting to explore this, but having discussed these things with you before and having had you like look at stuff in my chart before, it's you bring enough knowledge to the table that it doesn't matter if there's things you're still learning. Like you are definitely a solid person for this. So I think wholeheartedly people should check out your work. So where can they do that?
So I have a website that is www.studentofthestars.wordpress.com. And so you can find my consultations there. And yeah, I mean, I would love to consult for more magically operant clients. They're the best. Not that I don't love my non-magically operant clients, but hopefully through my careful counsel, they will soon become magically operant. Yeah, no, that thank you so much for saying that. And I try really hard. I think that my practice is definitely grounded in like several years of study and experience. So I don't mean to go too Saturn on it and not solar enough where I'm like downplaying my capabilities. But yeah, and then I'm also on Twitter at Occult Problems, which is probably the place where I'm most active, just like spouting my opinions.
So, our second episode is in the bag. Thank you so much for being here to listen. I hope people had as much fun listening to Catherine and I discuss astrology, remediation, Saturn returns, tesseracts, and parallel realities as we had talking about them. I first got some insight into Catherine's work as an astrologer while I sat in a Walmart parking lot one night and she did some relationship chart analysis for me. It was fun and provided a lot of insight. Since then, I have wholeheartedly recommended people check out Student of the Stars. If you want to geek out on quantum magic or jailbreak the Tesseract, all of the material for Ebony Anpu's system is available freely online. As for show stuff, our music today was the prelude to Wagner's Parsifal, as performed at the music festival in Beirut in 1927. This is a public domain recording. In the Company of Stars is available through your various favorite podcast outlets, so please subscribe to us there. You can also follow us and subscribe through my YouTube channel, Ararita418. You can follow my rather underused Twitter, @Ararita418, or follow us on the In the Company of Stars Facebook page. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll be joining us for more explorations of interesting occult topics.